Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know now, in our 34th year, I talk to writers about their craft, what they're working on, what they've accomplished, what they're planning for the future. It is a slightly wider net, however. As you know, we have had on occasionally sculptors, painters, musicians. So if you have an idea for an artist who might be a good fit for the Writer's Block, writer or otherwise, watch for our address at the end of the show. We'd be very happy to get your suggestions. I also want to remind you that the Writer's Block and all the productions coming out of 1623 Studios are a result of cable access television, a wonderful community asset. Stick with cable, stick with the Writer's Block. Tonight, I'm happy to say, we do have a writer, a poet by the name of Lenore Balliro, who is going to read a poem that's now on the Gloucester 400 site, and you can see the website superimposed on our screen. And you can read it for yourselves there. It's about a letter, or in the form of a letter, to the people in Lanesville to whom she sold her house. Welcome to the Writer's Block.
Thank you, John. Delighted
Lenore.
to be here.
Tell me a little bit about your background. Where are you from originally, and how did you find Gloucester?
Originally, I'm from Bellingham, Mass., which is in the Blackstone Valley area of Massachusetts. It's kind of on the Rhode Island border, very small town, and not much there to capture the imagination, except for nature, which was an important.
What valley did you say?
Blackstone Valley.
Blackstone.
The Blackstone River runs through it. Yeah, it's it borders Woonsocket, Rhode Island. It's a very small town, and my family actually used to visit a friend of my dad's in Gloucester in the summer, and I fell in love with it when I was a young girl, and then I lived in the Boston area for many years, and when my daughter finished with high school, I was looking to live near the sea, and I was drawn up here. And I discovered Lanesville, which is where I ended up by accident because I went the wrong way around the rotary. And it took me all the way up, and I ended up stopping for a cup of coffee, and I said, what is this beautiful place? And I ended up buying a home there and living there for 12 years.
12 years?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How did you discover, so that's how you discovered Gloucester, how did you discover poetry?
You know, that's a really good question. I always loved language, the nuances of language from the time I was a little girl. My mom liked to tell the story of my aunt picking me up at the beach and saying, oh, look, you're picking up stones. And I said, no, they're pebbles. And I said, there are many pebbles. And I was always very mesmerized by the exact nature of words. And I started writing probably in middle school and then seriously in high school. I took creative writing instead of home ec.
I can tell you have an affection for words, a respect for words, and the diction is, word choice in your poems is very, very remarkable.
Well, thank you.
Dylan Thomas talks about tumbling for words,
that's nice.
When he was very young. I wanted to mention that because you turned to poetry early, you have been widely published in many magazines, including the Louisville Review, the Red Cedar Review, and here in Gloucester at the Gloucester Writers Center for flash fiction Dream of Revenge in Film Noir, which won the Bianchini Award, as well as another previous award, Rhode Island State Council for the Arts Award in poetry. So you've had quite a career.
And still working on it.
Good, good. There's a lot of poetry out there to be done and handled. Now, I mentioned in the introduction the poem about Lanesville and selling your house in Lanesville. Tell us where that came from before you read it for us.
Sure. Yeah. You know, The transfer of my home to new owners was an interesting transaction because I sold it to neighbors who had been renting across the street from me, and we kind of did it on a handshake. It was an interesting, more personal transaction than
Nice old-timey.
it was. I mean, we still went through, the legal process and so on, but we didn't use realtors, and it was someone who I knew would love, loved Lanesville, wanted to stay there, had roots, wanted to develop roots here. So when I was putting together some notes for them, because I wanted to tell them some details about the house and its idiosyncrasies and my garden and so on, I thought, okay, well, there's a list I can leave, but I wanted it to be much more heartfelt. And I felt, very emotional about it. So I decided to write them a letter in the form of a poem. And I still keep in touch with them. And they asked me recently, can we frame that poem and hang it? Do you mind? I said, no, I'd be totally honored if you put that on the wall in your home. So
Yes, I know the neighborhood. I have friends on High Street, so I know the neighborhood, and I know the attraction of, say, burying a dog on your property and separating from that kind of thing.
Right.
So would you share with us, I want to remind all our audience, share with us the poem that's also on the Gloucester 400 Stories and Poems website. So would you share this with us, please, Lenore?
I'd be delighted. I would be delighted. So it's called Letter to the New Owners of My Home, Lanesville. Do not be alarmed when, lying in your bed on the 3rd floor, you feel the house shake from the strong northwest winds rushing in off Ipswich Bay. That wind howls a deep sorrow scraped off the waves. It cannot be silenced. Make friends with it. Do not be afraid. The house was built by a capable Finn, 1897, and it bends like the black locusts bend and regains its posture once again. Remember that honeysuckle blooms early in spring. Orange blossoms claim the porch railings and scent your morning air, and the anise hyssop will rise high in July, purple and fragrant, and the red bee balm will call the hummingbirds. Pick a few blossoms from each. Place tender petals onto each other's tongues and savor. The bees love it here, especially the flowering mint that's fought with the weeds and persists. Pick it for your mojitos or tea, or just squeeze the leaves between your fingers as you walk to work to teach the first graders at Plum Cove School. Inhale deeply. I'll leave you a list with my favorite tradesmen, Mike and Kerry, and Felipe, who can do anything, and Frank, whose daughter owned this house before me. Joe, my plumber, retired. I still miss him. I hope you make love in every room in this house, and I hope you notice the elders around you, offer what you can. Jan's stories will entertain you. Amsterdam back in the day, and tales of Friesland, his native land. I hope your sweet dog gets her own spot in the backyard where she can dig her heart out like mine did next to the granite wall where I cut back the errant wild rosebush. I buried his ashes there, marked by a driftwood cross. Please allow him this final place to rest. Here is the key. There's another one hidden in a place my girl makes fun of, but this is Lanesville, so you won't need it anyway.
Very nice, very nice. Lanesville is a pretty safe place, as is Gloucester.
Yes.
I love, we were talking about word choice. The diction in this poem is very wonderful. I think deep sorrow scraped off the waves is marvelous line.
Oh, thank you.
Marvelous phrase.
Well, you know that deep resonance, right? When it howls and
Yes.
yes, right.
Yes, especially for Gloucester, because there's been so much loss here. When you write, what's the process?
I generally start with an image or a phrase that's stuck in my head, and And I let that kind of propel me into a first draft, which is often surprising. The language, usually follows that first idea or image. I might have an idea of a story, a narrative, but sometimes it's images that just suggest other images. And I write it quickly in a draft form, and then I let it sit. I read it out loud to hear what it sounds like. And then I go in and make several revisions. Because usually after the first draft, I find kind of the center of the poem. And sometimes I'm surprised at, where it takes me. I don't know if you've experienced that when you write, but, and then I go back in and I try to tighten the language and work on the form a little bit. But that sometimes doesn't occur to me until I go back into the revision process.
Yeah, I know the creative process shifts and zigs and zags. What was, now the sale of your house is clearly the prompt here. What was the first phrase or the first clause that popped into your mind? Do you remember?
I don't remember it, but I do remember lying in bed because it was a very tall house, balloon construction, so it was built, I guess, so that it would sway a little bit on purpose right?
The Finn playing that?
Yeah, and it used when I first moved in, I was a little unnerved by it. Like it felt like I was in a boat.
It's a bedroom's on the third floor.
Yeah, so I was thinking about sharing that feeling with the new owners so that they wouldn't be startled by it, and I think that's where I took off. Like, don't worry about this. It's all fine. It's a solid house. It's not going anywhere. And then from there, I started thinking about all the things I also wanted to share with them about it.
So you lead with that sensation, lying in bed, listening to the howling. Third floor. I can't think of a house. Well, maybe a couple where I am are three stories, but it's not common.
It's interesting because it was built on a hill, so the first level was part of it was ledge and part of it was built out with wood. So that was kind of the basement level, but it was living space also. So then the second and third floor were the traditional living space floors, but essentially my bedroom was considered the third floor.
Well, it's going to be windy this weekend. Very windy this weekend on that third floor. Have they gotten back to you about how they're dealing with the third floor howling?
Oh, they haven't been specific about that, but they've really enjoyed living in the house. They have a 6-month-old now, so there's a new family there, which is bringing a different kind of life to it, which is nice for me to think about. And I've met the baby, and so
are they originally Gloucerites?
I don't know where they're from. I know that the man used to run a business in Gloucester for many years, a restaurant, and his wife teaches at Plum Cove School, but I think she's originally from Connecticut. So I don't think they're from Gloucester, but they've lived here for a long time.
And they're never going to leave.
I don't think so. I think they're pretty rooted here.
I love this poem, and I'm glad it struck me when I saw it on the website. I thought, I got to see if I can get in touch with her.
I'm so glad.
Because it's a very fine poem, and it's of course very coincident with the theme of the 400th anniversary of the city right now. You have brought a couple other poems I'd love to explore too. One that we talked about just before we started, went on the air, is about Gloucester and granite, which they're kind of synonymous in many poems, some of mine and some of yours. Can you talk about that poem, the second one, Gloucester, granite? This is not on the website, but should be.
Yeah, so I've been mesmerized by granite and the role of granite, the texture of it, the visual representation, the and then of course the history of mining granite, the quarries, and you know, since I moved up here, so and all the paintings and the drawings and the prints of granite that people have.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. It captivates me too. The beach of Magnolia, there's big slabs of granite coming up at an angle. You think, wow, it wasn't always the same kind of place.
Right.
Can imagine that kind of weight being moved, what kind of force that took.
And then when they did do, when I learned about things like feather and wedge and what that meant when they were, you know, pushing down the whatever the mechanical process to break the granite apart and leaving those tunnels into the stone, and and the way the light hits and the sharp edges of light on the granite, and then of course discovering the quarries and swimming in them and delighting in, you know, the vestiges of what, you know, the quarries offered to us from that industry.
Yes,
It's really fascinating. Yeah.
I often wonder if the quarries got pumped out, what we'd find at the bottom, or who'd we find at the bottom.
Yes, archives of years, right?
Yes. This poem is called Gloucester, Granite. Would you share this with us, please?
I'd love to. Gloucester, granite. It always comes back to granite, ledge fighting with light. Raucous paths landing who knows where, thousands of years after they melt, freeze, shift, lift themselves up like hips of an oh so willing woman. It comes back to rock, quarries where capable fins blasted, feather and wedge, lugged and loaded and shipped off island. Comes back to quarries where one can step into morning's watery lies, baptize the sinners of history. And if you can sneak past the guard, enter a pool where even weeds are not allowed. Some people get passes. Others hike over to Vernon's or Little Parker Pit, open to everyone. It comes back to granite, hieroglyphs etched for explosives, shards of metal deep in the bloody rust, grout piles swept into dangerous mountains, leftovers waiting to be of use.
Wonderful poem, wonderful poem. I can tell you spent time in the quarries.
Yeah, I love the quarries. And actually, grout piles was something that a friend of mine, Peter Parsons, who actually is a Lanesville native, told me about when I first moved up here. He explained, he said, he told me about grout. I said, grout is what's in between tiles. He said, no, these are called grout piles, and they're left over. You know, they're not good enough pieces to use for the industry. And he said, and all of our mothers would warn us, you know, don't climb up the grout piles because it was dangerous.
Yeah.
But they did it anyway. It was like a rite of passage. So you know, I learned some new vocabulary from learning about the quarries.
That's always fun, going into a new
right?
trade and doing a little research. I want to ask you a couple technical questions.
Sure.
Your poems do not rhyme in regular patterns, but you're very conscious of internal rhyme,
Right.
and assonance and consonants. Do you have guidelines for that, or do you just fiddle till it sounds good?
I don't have any guidelines. I just fiddle. And again, sometimes it's just a surprise. And then sometimes in the revision process, I'll select another word that does feel like it goes with the other word, you know, as far as assonance goes, or alliteration.
Yeah.
Were you thinking of something specific?
Well, I love the fourth line of the poem. Of years after they melt, freeze, shift, lift.
Yeah.
And
then
you
hips.
get the feel of lifting through the line picks up speed. The freeze, shift, lift. I love that. And there's a number of into morning's watery lies, baptize the sinners of history. The sinners of history. Wonderful, wonderful concept. Everybody fits there. When you do a draft of a poem, how many, on average, would you say are there drafts?
I used to go through, oh gosh, maybe 15 drafts, and I don't anymore. I've moved. Sometimes I'll do narrative poems like the letter. Sometimes they're lyrical and they have, stanzas. But a lot of my work recently has been in the prose poem form, so that has a much more fluid structure and openness to it than a more structured poem. And so those revisions, I might go through 3 or 4, as opposed to something that's tighter and more traditional form, where I'd go through, I don't know how many, until it got to the point where I was putting back words that I had taken out.
Do you put things away for a month or so?
Yes, sometimes I do. Yep. I mean, even for years, I still go back and revise.
Oh, do you do?
Yeah, I still go back and. I mean, once something's been published, I usually leave it alone. But if it hasn't been published, I'll often go back in if I'm feeling like in a dry spell where I'm not generating new work. I'll go back to a draft and I'll revise it.
And then if it's published, it's locked in. Unless for your.
For me, it is. Yeah.
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 Some of our viewers might not be familiar with the term prose poem. Sounds like a contradiction there. Would you define that for us, and what you try to reach for that's poetic in the prose?
Right. It is, and there's one of my favorite prose poets. He's a Swedish, Thomas Tranströmer. Thomas Tranströmer. He's a master of the prose poem, and they're not surrealistic per se, but they often have that quality where you have to enter into almost like a mythical space of language and let it carry you along. So it probably doesn't have a narrative per se. It doesn't have a structure, but the language is very suggestive and full of imagery and very fluid. And I think overworking those sometimes destroys that freshness. So that's a new terrain for me.
Does his work and does your work, when it's prose, follow standard prose grammatical guidelines?
Not for the poetry, no. I mean, I use periods and capital letters and things like that, and I don't think there's any need to fracture the grammar, but it's not expository the way it would be like an essay.
So there's freedom in organization.
Yes.
But the form is there. A paragraph. It looks like a paragraph.
Right.
Doesn't look like a stanza.
It looks like a paragraph, yeah. Yeah. I don't think I brought any samples of prose poems.
I noticed that the award you won at Gloucester Writers Center is for flash fiction.
Yeah, that was only
which is very, flash fiction, actually, very, very short, brief, fictional fiction. It could be one paragraph, 2 paragraphs, 3 paragraphs, but short.
Yeah, I think we were limited to 200 words.
Oh yeah, that's
so
small.
I had to really compress, get this. I get a story in, but I think drawing from an approach to poetry to heighten the language of it, of the flash fiction.
So no long narrative poems.
Right.
I want to ask you to read another poem, and there's one here that you gave me a copy of that has a nice Gloucester reference into it. That I'd like you to read for us. Swimming in the near dark at Plum Cove Beach. Could you read that for us? Plum Cove is over Lanesville ways. Not quite all the way to Lanesville, but on the ways. I'm sure most of our audience knows where it is.
I think it was 437 steps from my house.
That close.
It's really close, yeah. It was a very special place, yeah. So I'm delighted to read it.
Okay.
Swimming in the near dark at Plum Cove Beach. The moon rises plump drunk from last night's excesses. Across the cove, the sun resists its descent. My body hovers in cold water, accepts a blessing, salt and seaweed. On another coast, a man waits for me. This time, I do not question my worthiness, my flaws transparent as the eels at perigee moon.
Plump drunk moon on the day after a night of excesses. I've certainly been there and understand. It's a wonderful, wonderful assonance, I guess that is, plump drunk. And it's a nice poem. Made me want to go swimming at Plum Cove Beach, which I've never done. But maybe
it's the best place to swim because it's very calm.
Maybe soon. Where was that published, Lenore?
Actually, I don't remember. I don't remember where that one was published.
Do you actively send out poems now? Actively and continually?
I do, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We're almost out of time.
Okay.
I want to ask you one more brief question. What would you advise to anybody watching, young, middle-aged, old, who wants to write poetry? What should they?
I would say read a lot of poetry. Read as much as you can. Read a variety of forms. Read Walt Whitman. Read Thomas Transtromer. Read Emily Dickinson. Read contemporary poets who are winning, whatever the Pulitzer Prize winners are right now. It doesn't matter. Just immerse yourself in poetry so that you get a feel for what's possible. It's not easy. It's not easy to do.
I like that idea, the advice. To write, read.
Read, read other poets. See who you like. See what inspires you. Use your senses as much as possible. Smell, taste, hearing, not just what you see, but all of your senses, and bring those images into your work.
Be concrete.
Be concrete,
Be present, it's good advice. Very good advice. I want to say, because we're almost out of time, Lenore, Balliro, I've enjoyed this half hour. Your poem is very, very strong. It's very inspiring. I enjoyed it. Not only the poems you read for us, but the others that you shared with me by email. It's really good stuff. So thanks for sharing that with us.
Well, thanks for your feedback, John. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
I want to thank you in TV land for being with us as well. If you've learned something about Lenore Balliro and her poetry, her love for her house in Lanesville, which she had to part with, then the Writer's Block has done its job. I hope to see you again next week on the Writer's Block. Good night.